Hi YouTubers, hi subscribers, how are you? Now, as promised, I'm going to do, I'm going to use Josh Milton's piece in PinkNews.co.uk to talk about the Sunday Times article that came out on the 14th of June about the scrapping of the GRA consultation. About the GRA consultation and the possible scrapping of any plans to listen to the 70 odd people who supported trans rights in the report. Now, I believe the Sunday Times article was a white paper, but I haven't read the article for two reasons. One, I'm not giving them any of my money to print transphobic stuff, so they're not getting any of my money. And two, the problem, the article may be misleading in some instances, and the government might not be doing everything that the article talked about. So it was a hit piece, but I'm going to go through this article by Josh Milton in pinknews.co.uk. I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to talk about it. So here we go. Boris Johnson is scrapping long overdue plans to allow trans people to self-ID despite overwhelming public support. The British government, after spending a grueling 2 years stalling the results of a public forum to discuss the future of trans rights, have opted to not listen to the public at all, and allegedly ignore and ditch considerations for self-IDing system altogether. The critical legislative reform, which would have made it easier for people to change their gender, will reportedly be abandoned and replaced with a series of padlocked policies to better protect single-sex spaces. Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his ministers will allegedly shelve the plans developed under Theresa May's government and instead placate the LGBT+ community, journalist Tim Shipman wrote, by announcing a ban on conversion therapy following an outcry. An insider told the Sunday Times that government's response to the public consultation is basically ready and will be announced at the end of July. But concerns have been raised at trans activists who note that the responses has, for the most part, little to do with reform to the GRA and more to do with single-sex spaces. The legislation is likely to be introduced later this year or early next year, a source said, whilst a second government source said that the Prime Minister will have final say on the recommendation. Single-sex spaces are protected under the Equalities Act 2010. And the Tories are very clear when they set out plans for GRA reform in 2018 that they were not proposing to amend not proposing any amendments to the Equalities Act 2010. Spearheaded by Liz Truss, the Minister for Women's Inequalities, earlier this year announced changes to access trans youth have to healthcare, which has been protested by tens of thousands of people, provoked concern from the official LGBT+ groups from every UK political party, and caused alarm among parents of trans youth. The alarm was focused on Truss's comments regarding access to healthcare for trans youth and trans women access to single-sex spaces, neither of which are currently covered by the GRA. Despite 70% backing of self-ID of trans people, British government will shelve GRA reform, sources say. It truly caps off a dispiriting time for trans Britons, where a topsy-turvy fight for equality became a drawn-out battle steeped in transphobic vitriol from some lawmakers and anti-trans groups determined to stymie the life-changing reform. Trans folk have, in the meantime, been subjected to rocketing rates of discrimination against them, whether it be by biting words from the columnists or transphobic from cuddles into violence. In short, the government announced an avenue to reform in 2004 Gender Recognition Act, the bedrock of gender recognition law in the UK. It makes it easier for trans folk to acquire a gender recognition certificate which, in the eyes of the law, recognises that gender identity matches that of their sex. It governed the process by which trans people can update their gender marker on their birth certificate for the last 16 years. According to Insider, more than 100,000 respondents were received from the public consultation on how to change the GRA. An overwhelming 70% backed self-declaration, but officials felt the results were skewed by an avalanche of responses generated by trans rights groups. However, in the poll put forward to the public, 56% of people were in favour of trans people being able to self-ID their gender. It remains unclear whether the YouGov poll was similarly skewed by trans rights groups somehow. Indeed, for trans Britons that wish to carry out a mundane life, blandly using public bathrooms, visiting GPs, or trying out discounted clothes in retailers is a dream apparently too much to ask. Liz Truss allegedly announced ban on conversion therapy in July. Now the insider claims a slew of new policies will be announced constellating around the GRA. For example, safeguards will be enforced to protect single-sex spaces, reaffirming provisions in the Equalities Act. While guidelines will be introduced to streamline public lavatories across Britain, patchwork of local authorities which have given rise to gender-neutral facilities, local authorities following the Equalities Act, which states that gender reassignment is a protected characteristic. As a result, trans men are entitled to access same facilities and services as other men, and trans women are entitled to access same facilities and services as other women. While under the 2004 GRA, where the full gender recognition certificate is issued to a person, the person's gender becomes, for all purposes, the acquired gender. Moreover, the protection still applies before the certificate itself is issued, as long as the trans individual can demonstrate they are pursuing a GRC, such as socially living in defined gender, which includes restrooms. I'm sorry I'm sweating a bit. It's very hot in the studio. Finally, a plank of policy change will be to ban conversion therapy, which will, the source said, apply to both church groups and therapists. It remains unclear whether the ban will involve wholesale regulation of the psychotherapy cultures. The article by Josh Milton Goat shows some tweets from some activists who were terrified at what was going on. It then goes on to say the Gender Recognition Act, a quick guide. GRA is a mechanism that allows trans people to apply for gender recognition certificate and the change of gender on their birth certificate. Current trans people must prove that they have lived in their gender for 2 years and have a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, after which their application for a GRC is approved or refused by a panel of people who don't meet them. Reforming the GRA to allow trans people to self-identify their gender, then when applying for a GRC without a medical diagnosis or the need to prove their lived gender, has been called for by Stonewall and other LGBT plus organisations. Former Prime Minister Theresa May announced that the GRA will be reformed in PinkNews article in 2017. Speaking at the PinkNews Awards in 2017, May vowed to streamline the GRA to make it easier for trans people to change their legal gender. A public consultation was held on how to reform the GRA, which received more than 100,000 responses in 2018. In particular, most trans people self-identify their gender in their day-to-day lives, as the GRC is not required to access gender spaces such as bathrooms or changing rooms. But self-ID has become a cornerstone of the backlash against the GRA reform from some anti-trans feminists. Whilst I'll mop my furrowed brow. I don't know, because I didn't read the Sunday Times article, but reading this article in Pink News, I am not too worried that the government is going to crack down on, say, trans women like myself using same-sex, single-sex, cisgendered women changing rooms, if you like, so to muck in with the rest. I don't think they're going to change that because, as it said, it comes under the Equalities Act 2004 and 2010. But it's a difficult one because I self-ID'd. When I first transitioned in 2004, I self-ID'd. I just dressed as a woman, wore women's clothes, walked around the town, carried myself as a... Do you know what I mean? I did it. Now, I was on hormones to start with, but only naughtily because I was taking my sister's contraceptive pill. I didn't use the women's bathrooms from 2004 until I transitioned the second time in 2013, 2012. The main reason for that was in 2004, when I was using the same-sex bathrooms, the single-sex bathrooms, I was hounded out by a group of women who quite clearly realised I was trans and just chucked the verbals at me and made me feel uncomfortable. I mean, I literally walked into the bathroom and then had to turn around and walk back out again. So after that, I used the disabled loos up until 2012 when I transitioned the second time. And then since then, I've always used the women's bathrooms. I've never had a problem. I just go in, pee, do my business, wash my hands and leave. And it's not an issue, and it shouldn't be an issue, but it's something that the media has whipped up into a frenzy to scare predominantly cis straight women. It's the same arguments they used against gay and lesbian and bisexual people during the 80s and early 90s, especially around Section 28, and that being introduced into law in 1987, I believe it was. I might be wrong. This is worrying though. 70% of respondents were positive about self-ID, and the government is ignoring it. Now, this is interesting because the Tories have been using the trans community as a whipping horse since the general election back in December, when they used opinion polls and focus groups to try out anti-trans policies on them to see what their reaction was. And so the government, on the whole, if you are trans, don't look for any reforms or publicity or developments for trans folk, because the government's not going to do it. And if you're LGB, other than the T, you probably won't get any legislation in your favour either, other than the conversion therapy ban. It is a very difficult question to answer about whether some people support self-ID. Now, I am not in support of someone just waking up in the morning, slapping on a load of women's clothing, piling on the makeup and saying I'm a woman. Most trans people don't do that, because we are going through some form of medical process anyway. We're on hormones, we're seeing a GP, we're seeing a consultant, whether it be private or public. We're going through a gender identity clinic. We're going through some form of medical process. You can self-ID when you first start, because that's the natural way of doing it. But the natural process once you've done that is to go into the medical field, and then you are being treated for your gender identity, if you like. And you receive your medication. You can apply for a GRC if you fancy it. But the problem with the GRC is it's a long, convoluted process, because you have to pay for it. You need a letter from your GP, you need a letter from the gender identity clinic, you may need a letter from your employee, you need to show you've been living in role for 2 years. And the panel that decides whether you're trans enough or not is made up of cis, predominantly straight people who never meet you. And so their decision weighs heavy. So the trans community was desperate for self-ID to get up to streamline the GRC and make it easier for people like me to apply. Now, I've never applied because it's too complicated and it's too long-winded and it's too bureaucratic. So it looks like it's going to stay that way, and we're going to have to try and wait for a change of government, although Labour isn't engaging in this gender debate either. They're staying off the subject as much as they possibly can. Thanks, Labour, for your support. So I wanted to go through that and give you my brief idea. I'm coming up against the time, so I'm going to try and get a few bits in. So basically, we're not going to get the reforms we need. I'm hoping they don't rule against us using single sex of our gender identity facilities, and we can still use bathrooms. I'm hoping that doesn't change. Look out for any vlogs I do on this subject again. I will be doing more. Look after yourselves, folks, and I'll see you next time. And I'm sorry I'm sweaty. Goodbye. Oh, please like, share and subscribe.